Welcome to Mentoring Moments. Mentoring Moments is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast. It is composed of clips taken from Jason's one-to-one and group mentorship sessions. Welcome to another episode of the E-Commerce Edge podcast with me, your host, Jason Greenwood. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our incredible next guest, Mr. Patrick Ward, and he is from International Supply Consulting North America. Wow, that is an absolute mouthful. Welcome, Patrick.
Yes, great to be on. And we do international supply consulting. We shortened up the ISC because International Supply Consulting North America is a lot to say. But yeah, we're a supply consulting firm specializing in smaller consumer good brands to about $100 million.
Wow, amazing. And how did you come to be in this crazy world of supply chain? You have been in this industry for a long time, working for, other manufacturing networks, supply chain companies, Zazzle, Minted, head of supply chain and ops. So you've got an ops and a supply chain management background. And obviously that, I'm guessing that led you to decide, hey, let's actually do this as similar to me. I went through a similar journey, worked inside brands, built agencies, and then decided, hey, I need to go independent. I need to get out on my own, and I need to become an independent consultant for B2B e-commerce. And that's how my path evolved. Did you go down a similar path, but for supply chain?
Yeah, I started out, I was originally a banker, and my banking career ended in 2008, and I got involved in a group that we built a packaging and party goods facility from scratch. So that literally meant we started out with an empty warehouse and ended up with about a $50 million business. That I did everything in that business, from operating machinery to bolting it together to packaging stuff to international sales. So it was like working in several separate companies because there were so many stages that we went through. So that really got me started on this supply chain journey. So it was very traditional manufacturing. And moving on from that, I started a company that we were importing home goods like furniture from China. So and unfortunately, that didn't pan out, mostly because I learned a lot about how pay-per-click advertising does and does not work. But it gave me a lot of insight into more of the international side of things and the entrepreneurial side of things. Jumped from that to bigger companies that we mentioned, Minted and Zazzle, as well as smaller companies as well. And just done a lot of, you've ended up doing a lot of responding to the market and supply chain. So I've done, as I said, consumer goods, I've done PPE. If you can think of it, I worked on it. And what I found in that is the basics are the same across industries. There are very few spots where there's something dramatically different. The terminology may be different, but we're still moving things around the world. Getting it manufactured, getting it moved, getting it delivered, whatever that means, omni-channel, like whole deal. So that's the expertise I bring. There's obviously a lot in it, and I'm never going to say I know everything about supply chain because I definitely don't. But yeah, that's where that's the basics of my background.
I love it. I tell you, it's interesting because if you'd have asked me 15 years ago, is supply chain sexy? Is logistics sexy? Is internal and external logistics sexy? I would have said, not really. I like the commerce side of it, the actual point where technology interfaces with the customer experience. That's the bit that always excited me. But then I had the opportunity inside of a brand to basically help with the solution architecture, design, and implementation of a whole new OMS, WMS, warehousing system, carouseling operation, new pick, pack, dispatch technology, and work through that entire process because we were replatforming our ERP. We're implementing a new OMS, WMS system alongside the ERP implementation. We ended up implementing NetSuite and Vox as our WMS inside of our owned warehouse. I learned a whole bunch more about logistics than I ever wanted to know. I learned about chaotic put away and warehouse utilization and pick efficiency and pick segmentation. And I learned so much about warehousing and logistics. But I tell you, I realized at that point, after I went through that internal process, I had been architecting these components of a commerce stack for a long time, but I never understood the firsthand impact of those technologies on a warehouse operation until I worked inside one and made sure that it was actually functioning the way that it was supposed to inside of a warehouse. But I tell you, I realized at that point, I had almost an epiphany that e-commerce is ultimately logistics with a pretty face. That's basically what it is. It was at that point that I realized actually logistics and supply chain will make or break your business, whether you like it or not. This obviously is in relation to physical goods. If you're doing something else that's non-physical goods, then it's a different story. But in relation to physical goods, the strength, breadth, and depth of your supply chain, your carrier partnerships, your technology capabilities, your ability to pick, pack, and ship efficiently, whether that's using a 3PL or owned warehousing, all of these things come together to make or break your business from not only a revenue perspective, not only from a fulfillment and customer satisfaction perspective, but also from a margin perspective. And at what point did you realize that same thing, that logistics, because a lot of people you talk to about logistics and supply chain and their eyes glaze over, but for people like us that have realized the importance of it to everything that happens in the world, it's pretty sexy.
Yeah, in terms of that realization, that was actually fairly early on in the manufacturing side of things, that we were exporting from the United States to all over the world. And man, the logistics side of things, it just killed you, that you get into places where you just could not get the product there. And it was just a ton of work on figuring out how we were going to get things to customers. So that's really what I've had my first big realization about. And the other one was actually about spare parts, that we made choices on the equipment we bought based on what we thought the spare parts support was going to be. So think about it this way. You have a choice tomorrow of you're going to buy a new car. You're going to buy a Honda or a Ferrari. If you buy a Ferrari, you're going to be waiting for spare parts. And that seems fairly obvious when you put it that way. But you might say, okay, I'm going to buy the Honda. Now you have a choice of a Honda versus, I don't know, the new competitor to a Honda that doesn't have local support. You have the same choice to make. You may be getting a better deal from the new competitor, but man, if you can't get spare parts, you're pretty screwed.
Yes. Man, that's so incredibly true. Now let's talk about two of the biggest disruptions to the commerce supply chain over the last 5 years. Obviously, the first being COVID, two being Donald Trump and tariffs and everything else. And regardless of what you feel about Donald Trump and his moves within the government, I happen to agree with most of the stuff he and Elon are doing. But regardless of whether you agree with him or not, the reality is he is reshaping the world order around logistics and manufacturing bases and taxes and tariffs and everything else. He's single-handedly disrupting supply chains around the world right now. And to a similar degree and to a similar level to what we saw during COVID. And at the beginning of COVID, it was just, even for my agency clients that I was working with at the time, they didn't know whether they were Arthur or Martha. They didn't know whether they were coming or going. They didn't know whether they were going to be able to get things. They didn't know whether they were going to be able to get it by sea, air, carrier pigeon. It was an absolute nightmare. And it actually put some businesses out of business. And in the span of 3 months, I know, because I was still based in New Zealand at the time, the cost of getting a shipping container from China to New Zealand quadrupled in the span of literally a couple of months. And it all of a sudden and obviously consumers couldn't absorb all of those cost increases. So it was a bit of a cost sharing exercise between the manufacturers in China, the importers in New Zealand, and the customers who were buying or the retailers that were selling. And it was a cost sharing exercise across the whole supply chain to try to absorb those shocks to the best of the supply chain's ability. But I think what it proved to me and reiterated to me, because I always thought supply chains were pretty resilient around the world, but COVID proved one thing: supply chains are extremely fragile. And up to that point, there was many businesses and many importers and many manufacturers that relied on just-in-time capabilities globally. And we realized there's not enough fat in our supply chain to absorb any shock, let alone a COVID scale or a tariff change scale shock. What was your experience going through that? And are there parallels between what happened during COVID and what's happening today with the tariff changes?
There are definitely parallels that I think that you hit on the most important thing, which is there's not enough slack in our systems, that everything is just in time. As a supply chain professional, this was obvious to me a long time ago. I don't think that anybody who has done much supply chain work or even been involved in it should be unaware of this. I think, though, that we're talking about an emotional understanding and mentality aspect of things. That my joke that I made for years, I would swear to you that there was a class at the Harvard Business School in 1995 called "It's Always Cheaper in China." That if you can't maybe able to get it cheaper. Although I personally think that particular vein has been thoroughly mined. Things are as cheap as they're going to get. But if that's your entire strategy for how you're going to accomplish your goals, you're really hooking yourself up to a very brittle structure. It's fine if nothing ever happens. And maybe that's good enough for some people that they just say, sure, I can live with this risk. But I don't think people understand the risk that is involved in that. Now, how do you get around that? And I do think that COVID and our current tariff situation, tariff chaos are analogous. You have to figure out how important low costs really are to you and what that really means to you. That if I'm going to design a resilient supply chain for you, there's going to be more than one vendor. We're going to figure out what the key inputs are, and we're going to make sure that we can get those from more than one spot. Here's an example of a non-resilient supply chain that, blows my mind when I think about it. So when we get new outdoor jackets, like Gore-Tex jackets, there are 2 factories in southern China that make the underlying material. So that means that supply chain is dependent on one choke point functionally. So how do we get around that? I don't know. I'm not in the jacket space. I'm not in the Gore-Tex material space, and I'm not making that stuff. But it's an area where it's going to be very difficult until somebody stands up a new facility somewhere else to really ameliorate that. Now, as a brand, what are you going to do about that? If you're the North Face, maybe you're willing to accept somewhat higher costs and put another facility somewhere else. If you're a smaller brand, like you probably need to move away from a just-in-time scenario to accept somewhat higher costs and bring on more inventory when you can get it. But these are choices that most companies have not had to make in a very long time. They're shoving all the responsibility to the consumer, which means the consumer is just not getting their stuff.
Wow, that is so true. And certainly, not only do we simply warehouse more locally in the destination country or destination region or market where we need to sell into to buffer ourselves from supply chain shocks, but then do we get caught with overstock? Do we then have to liquidate stock at no margin or at a loss if we carry it for too long? I think sales momentum can change on a dime, it feels like, especially at retail. It's a real challenge. And one of the things that I've seen some retailers do, particularly in the fashion and apparel space, is look at what alternative underlying materials are available that maybe are an equivalent or a close equivalent. Maybe not a direct replacement, but a close equivalent. And I'll give you an example. So for a long time, Kathmandu, which is a major outdoor products designer, manufacturer, and retailer in New Zealand and Australia, and they export to the world, but they're primarily well-known in New Zealand and Australia. I noticed over a period of time, because I shopped with them for many years, when I first started shopping with them, their primary waterproof material or breathable waterproof material was Gore-Tex. But then they started designing their own waterproof breathable material that had similar properties, but they called it something else, and they had other manufacturers that made that material for them. So they were getting into a little bit of material science, basically, to where they reduced their dependence on Gore-Tex by saying, we're gonna build or create and design an equivalent replacement product. So maybe we continue to sell Gore-Tex products too, but should something happen to that product, we can quickly pivot to making the underlying material, this other alternative material that we own, we've branded, we designed it, we have it manufactured to our specifications, and now we're no longer reliant. Are you seeing more and more of that happening where substitute products, even if they're not the name branded products, substitute products are being designed, and I don't know, maybe manufacturing locations being built in Vietnam or Singapore or Bangladesh or Mexico, where I'm based, where these alternative products are being designed and made in alternate places other than China to insulate or help insulate against these types of supply chain shocks?
That's very much on everybody's minds, but it really depends on the company. So an outdoor brand like Kathmandu can probably go to Toray, who would be another major manufacturer of those types of materials, and get Toray to figure it out for them. And I know that Patagonia does this. They sell Gore-Tex. They rebrand Toray as whatever they call it. It's a house brand name. I can buy Toray. I can buy standard Toray fabric. So there's at least some, in that case, there's some differentiation. There's some backup. I think that we really underestimate, however, you mentioned going to Vietnam, going to Mexico. everybody wants to go to Vietnam for a while. Now that feels good because it gets you out of China. Let's talk about the scope of China versus Vietnam. There's 30 million people or something in Vietnam. That it's not
Yeah.
very big.
Yeah.
It's like a city in China.
Yes.
We cannot functionally move everything to Vietnam. Mexico is the other great option. Mexico is massively smaller than China as well. So we need to
Yes.
think long and hard about how we're going to actually back these systems up and what that means in terms of scale. Now, you can be smarter and use more machinery, which I think we will have to do, and figure out how to spread things out. But that doesn't change the fact that we as a human civilization have chosen to focus so much of our supply chain in China that it's very hard to move those things. This is just geographic concentration. It happens to be China. We do this in a lot of other cases as well. As a supply chain professional, that scares me. But I've still got to sell leadership on the idea that we should actually figure out a way to insulate ourselves in some sense from that geographic concentration. Those are hard things to do. And for a lot of leadership, they are so focused on, if you're selling into big box retail, you've got so much price pressure that low cost, whatever that means, that incentivizes geographic concentration, because then you can give all the volume to one producer, gives you
Yes.
better pricing.
Yes.
Versus insulating yourself from that one producer risk is going to raise prices. There are trade-offs in all of this. I don't know how much more the consumer will take before they have real problems.
Yes.
And we saw the big thing with inflation, but I can tell you that if we raise prices 10% and put the slack into the supply chain, we would be better off from a resilience standpoint by a long shot.
And do you think that perhaps that whilst global supply chains are squealing today about COVID and the overhang of COVID, and squealing today about tariffs and the uncertainty that's bringing to the table, do you think that maybe this is a good time to use these things as an excuse to start building in that additional slack that's probably going to raise global prices on everything by around 10%? Do you think that this is the Rahm Emanuel famously said after 9/11, you never want to let a good crisis go to waste, right? And so I feel like maybe this tariff situation, maybe there's a silver lining here that says, hey, this is a golden opportunity for us to refactor supply chains everywhere in the world and justify those much needed diversification investments, and basically blame it on Trump or blame it on tariffs or blame it on whatever, but just having a reasonable excuse to be able to build some additional slack, whether that's because realistically, I feel like India, and I'd love your take on this, is probably the only other country that can absorb a China scale level of manufacturing capability. But maybe we have to diffuse this across 20 different countries instead of just one additional country.
Yeah, I agree with you that India is the only spot that if I had to move China, that's obviously the only spot that has the capability to do it.
Yep.
And to your point, if I could wave a magic wand and tell people to do things, yes, I would use this as an excuse to diversify supply chains. I would go find 3 other vendors in 3 other countries. I would do Africa, I would do Eastern Europe, I would do Latin America, and I would make sure there was enough capacity to do that across all of those locations. And I would eat the additional cost. As I said, I think it would cost us, from a consumer side, I think we'd be paying about 10% more.
Yep.
That is purely a guess on my part.
Yeah. But this finger in the air, based on your experience, it's probably, and that aligns with some of the, I guess, lingering price increases for the brands that did diversify after COVID. That hangover has had about a long-term 10% price effect on those verticals, categories, and suppliers.
Yep. Beyond that, to make that happen, we really need to suck it up and think hard about this. That's like, we as Western civilization have outsourced so much of this for so long that we've lost the muscle memory of how we're going to get all this done. So we're rebuilding expertise in the meantime. And that means that everything across supply chain has been underinvested for many years. And that's how we've achieved these low prices. It's not been cost-free. It just has appeared to be cost-free.
Yeah, you've effectively outsourced the costs. You've offshored the cost is what you've done. And so that makes sense. What do you think in terms of AI, robotics, automation? It feels like China is aware of these systemic global changes, and they want to become the automation supplier to the world instead of just the product supplier to the world. And by that, I mean, they seem to be acutely aware that there is a closing window of opportunity to be the manufacturer to the entire world. And they realize that everybody else is making moves to try to reduce the total and utter dependence on China as the primary manufacturer globally. And it feels to do an end run around that eventuality, which may happen in 5 to 10 years, where they're one of 5 major global manufacturing superpowers. It feels like they're saying, hey, we realize this. We see this is on the horizon. We're really good at this AI thing. We're really good at this robotic thing. Now, instead of manufacturing the end goods, we're going to manufacture things that make the end goods. And then we're going to export that to the world. So we're going to have all the robotic automation and we're going to supply that to the world.
I think that that's a good point. I think, though, that the idea that we're going to put robots everywhere, but AI everywhere in supply chains, I think is vastly overblown. I think that we dramatically underestimate the cost of doing that and how manual things are. That boutique supply chains for products that you haven't even thought about are a thing. And they've been in place for 50 or 100 years. And you have to look at each of these items and say, how much is this thing going to cost? I was at a Panama hat factory, and the machinery was built in the 1920s. Nobody is going to go make new Panama hat machinery. You're not going to do it.
How do they even maintain that equipment if that company that made that piece of machinery has probably long since gone out of business?
It was really simple machinery.
Okay.
It was just like a giant press with a heating element. It wasn't that hard. And I thought this in rural Ecuador. Yes. Nobody's going to go say, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to redesign the Panama hot supply chain, or we're going to spend $3 million on new machinery. This just doesn't make any sense.
Yes, I guess it depends on market size and scope and what the market opportunity looks like and what the opportunity cost is to fix that supply chain. So are you working primarily with manufacturers? Are you working primarily with distributors? Are you working primarily with retailers, or all three to help them improve their supply chain capabilities and resilience?
I work primarily with brands that are bringing something to market. We're going to figure out how to get it manufactured and brought to market, however you may think of it.
Amazing. So whether that be through contract manufacturing, whether that be through in-house manufacturing, but somewhere else in the world.
It's generally contract manufacturing, because most brands are not going to stand up a new facility.
No.
But that means contract manufacturing, logistics, 3PL, distribution.
Wow. Cool. And then are you helping them to also identify, isolate, and resource up for how much, how to manage demand planning, supply chain planning, domestic inventory holding, raw material supply that gets to the contract manufacturer, and managing how much inventory of the raw material needs to be held with the contract manufacturer? Because I was working, and the reason I asked this question is that I was working with a children's shoe brand designer and manufacturer a number of years ago. And so they did all the design. They had a full end-to-end PLM system that interfaced with their contract manufacturers, but they were responsible for all the raw material sourcing. So the leather, the rubber, the shoestrings, all that sort of stuff. And then it would turn up at the basically the warehouse door of the contract manufacturer, and they would hold that inventory, and then they would pull from that inventory to manufacture a run of product to a certain specification or a certain design. But it was up to that brand to manage that in end-to-end supply chain. And some of those raw materials were coming from 10 different countries to the ultimate contract manufacturer. And so it was not like the contract manufacturer said, leave it to us to source all the raw materials. You do that. And so it becomes, these people have to become operationally excellent in order to be able to make sure that they can hit, for example, a seasonal drop cycle. It becomes a real operational headache for them.
Yep. It depends on how deep you want to get on this. I have done all of the above. That a lot of the contract manufacturers do want to handle everything. That's why you use a contract manufacturer. I don't know who you should be buying boxes from in southern China right now.
Yes.
That said, if you want to dig that far in, we can go to it. But these are all like, you're building a series of supply chains. Think of these as modules that you build and you assemble. So the box supply chain in southern China is going to be like a printer, a box manufacturer, I don't know, whatever goes into that, a sticker manufacturer, all of those.
The wrapping paper that goes into it, the
Yeah, styrofoam molds, that's styrofoam mold guys and box manufacturers may be the same company, may not be the same company, but you're really working through a series of these things, and all that is an input into your ultimate good. Most companies are going to care about their primary materials. If we do paper, we want to know about the paper. We want to talk to the paper people. We want to go see their paper facility, but they're probably not going to care about the shrink wrap. Really, it's a matter of how deep are you going to dig on each one of these things. And that's the fundamental thing that you're trying to figure out. There's a push and a pull on this, because if we go out and try to understand all of this, it never ends. But there's always one more thing you can dig into. But it's a lot of time and a lot of effort. We're talking about, and just sticking with doing everything in China, we're talking about going to China for a couple of weeks and visiting factories. That means I'm not going to be in your forecasting meeting. I'm not going to be talking to the 3PL. That you've got to decide what your team can actually handle and what your team cannot handle.
Wow. So when you get in and you're starting to work, and I'm guessing most of these are D2C brands, so they are the manufacturer and the retailer of their own products, or are they an aggregator retailer in most instances?
Usually it's D2C, and that's what I would call omni-channel from my standpoint, that
Sure.
you are the brand and you are selling to consumers and you're selling to retailers. So to me, that's the same job, that we're just doing it.
Yep.
And those guys are going to be using contract manufacturers for the most part. It's very unlikely that they're going to have their own brands going, or own facilities going on.
And does it become infinitely more complex when, for example, their target market, their retail market might be United States, might be 3 or 4 countries in Europe, it might be 1 or 2 countries in LATAM, and then 1 or 2 countries in Asia, for example. That supply chain may need to be unique for those target destination markets, especially depending on tariffs, right? So it depends on, am I going to have a contract? That's a new wrinkle
for us. Yeah, we haven't really distinguished supply chains for the most part. We may have differences in packaging, but we haven't distinguished them based on actual location up to this point. We will be doing, but we have not had to do that so far.
Wow. And when you first start working with one of these manufacturing brands, house brands, whatever it might be, what is the typical state that you find them in? Or are you getting to them as a startup usually? Or are they an already fully operating business and you're brought in to basically help bring massive efficiencies to their operations from supply chain perspective?
I brought in later after things have started up. I have done pure startups, and usually that's the easiest, quite honestly, because I can do the work right up front. But going in after that, there's a lot of sorting things out that has to go on. That usually somebody's selling several $1 million worth of stuff by the time they bring somebody like me in, just because that's the point that I add a lot of value, that you got it set up. And now we're going to get this thing operating properly. We're going to trim the sails and we're really going to go. And we're going to get out of this very manual process part of things that we've been operating on so far.
Wow. And what do you think, do most of these, when they start up, are they, maybe if they were aware of just how complex this would get, maybe they would never be a startup in the first place, and maybe they would never get to the $2 to $5 million worth of annually in revenue. But do you find that they know going in that they're going to be relatively inefficient when they first start up, and that's just the cost of doing business when you're young and inefficient, and then they realize, oh, hey, actually, we're going to be able to claw back 2, 3, 4, maybe 5% of margin by bringing in someone like you and say, look, take a look at our entire supply chain and optimize the crap out of it. We're going to claw back some serious amount of margin on this.
I think the only people who realize that there's opportunity to claw back are people who've done it before. I think that if you have built supply chains and built brands before, you understand what's going to happen. I think for everybody else, most brand builders are so focused on sales and marketing that supply chain is a secondary concern. They want to see those sales first, and they want to see that growth trajectory. And if that thing is growing and they're not losing money on the supply chain, it's fine. It's only later when somebody says, man, you really got to clean up your logistics rates. You really have to clean up your parcel delivery, that I actually get involved with most brands.
And are you working primarily on that front end piece after the goods have been manufactured? Is that where you provide the most consulting firepower, or is it everywhere from raw materials to manufacturing to shipping goods out of a warehouse and getting it into the customer's hands and everything in between?
Today, most of what I do is that most brands have a manufacturing relationship set up. And generally,
Yes.
when I get involved, they are trying to figure out how they're going to ship better. Forecasting better is something we can talk about as well. That goes with sales and supply chain together. But they're trying to ship cheaper and better, whatever that may mean. And then they're trying to clean up their delivery operations domestically, wherever that is. That may mean that, again, they don't like their 3PL. They don't have a 3PL, that they've been using the same logistics vendor, the same freight carrier forever, and they don't have an idea if they're getting good rates. These are all relatively easy things for somebody like me to address, that you can bring in a seasoned senior supply chain leader. And if you're running a brand today, my advice is get those people. If you don't want to pay for them, you can get consultants like me, but you can bring those people in and they should be immediately capable of looking at your supply chain and saying, we're going to hit this, and get a structured solution for improving performance overall, whether that's better reporting, better rates, or even just making sure that you feel like you've done the best possible job.
Or in some cases, I guess it's just faster shipping and being able to get things into customers' hands quicker.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting thing. I think we over-index towards the Amazon Prime model of 2-day delivery. I think customer expectations are far more important than instantaneous delivery.
Yep.
I've never worked in Amazon. I know how they do it, but I don't think that my advice is to consumer good companies is don't focus on 2-day delivery. Focus on telling the customer how, when they're going to get their thing. They can wait for a week and you can still keep your prices low without trying to chase Amazon, which is a really expensive proposition.
Yeah.
But yeah, faster delivery is perfectly possible, even without trying to chase 2-day delivery. You can find pick and pack faster and really done on a more professional level if you're willing to go out and do the work behind it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. What do you think is, when you go in, I know this is how long's a piece of string, but on average, when you work with a brand like this, what is the average savings or margin clawback that you're able to achieve for them? Just as an average, some might be 10%, some might be 1%, but like on average, is it like 5% of margin you're able to get back for them?
Of margin, I would say that we could easily get back 5% of margin just by improving the basics. I would say a 10 or 15%. Probably 10% on the margin side is where I'd probably end up. Getting much beyond that, we're going to be re-engineering product. But a good example, and I did this recently for a brand, was just negotiated freight rates with one of the major parcel carriers. Nobody had done it. Nobody had thought to do it. It was maybe 10 hours of my life, and it saved like $80,000 within a month.
Wow. Yeah, that's phenomenal. And oftentimes brands don't realize that carriers are actually even negotiable. They think, oh, the rate is the rate, and it is what it is. They don't realize that they'll even have a conversation. Whereas I found that even as an aggregator retail brand that didn't do manufacturing, we would try to renegotiate our carrier rates every single year. That would be just part of our operational structure, is that every single year we were trying, and especially if they were trying to jack up our rates, that at that point, we would definitely try to negotiate with them, and we'd bring into the conversation their on-time delivery rate and everything else as part of the negotiating tactics. So I agree with you. I think many brands miss a trick just by not having an annual review of where all their primary cost inputs come from and seeing whether there's room to move there. So it makes total sense.
You had a key thing there, which is you do it every year, because I don't know, and the freight carriers don't know when the rates are going to be good, when you're going to get a good deal. So if you're not doing this on a regular basis, you're going to miss the opportunity to save a buck a package or whatever it's going to be. But you have to also have the people available and the information available to do that. I should be able to go into after Christmas on like February 1st. I should be able to go into that negotiation every single year for a brand. And everybody in the brand should know that we're going to do this every February. And we may get something better, we may not, but we're going to do it every February because it's going to be worth our time. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to overload our supply chain team to the point that they don't have time to do that, because that's just a false economy.
Couldn't agree more. And how do you make your money? Do you charge like on a project basis? Do you charge on an hourly rate basis? Do you charge on a percentage of margin saved basis? Like, how do you typically engage with your clients?
My personal preference is always to be on a project or retainer basis. Certainly, I have hourly contracts out there, but what I find is that I, from a headspace perspective, I would prefer to be able to give you the time that you need rather than be worrying about charging you for X number of hours. Obviously, if it's like really short, we're just going to have a conversation for an afternoon that we can do hourly. But for most things, I would prefer to put it into some sort of retainer project fee basis. I just find that keeps everybody better aligned, that you as the consultee are not feeling like you're being screwed on hours, and I as the consultant don't feel like I'm being restricted on what I can do. If I want to put an extra 5 hours on Saturday, I'm not worried about it.
Totally makes sense. I run a similar model, but mine's on a pure subscription rate basis, so it's not even a retainer. So yeah, very similar. Very similar thing is I like to dig deep with my clients, and I like for us to be aligned, which is we're trying to get an outcome, and we're trying to work together as fast and efficiently as we can to get that outcome, as opposed to me trying to pad my hours to make more money. Yeah,
I don't want to pad hours. Exactly.
Exactly. So. Yeah. So that makes sense. And what do you think is there, because of this tariff discussion? Do you think that your business is just going to explode? Like, I would assume that demand for your kinds of services would just go through the roof whenever there is a major disruption like a COVID or like a massive international trade war, that this just resets everything all at once. And it feels like you are like in the driving seat of being able to help businesses and brands deal with this.
I think that we are, as supply chain professionals, we are in a massive change. We have two things going on right now. We have what you mentioned right now, which is like tariff, global interruptions, all that, yes, is going to drive this. I think we've also massively underinvested in supply chain and the people for a long time. I'm in my 40s right now. There's a lot of supply chain people who are like in their mid 60s and are definitively like way behind on the tech. So yeah, I think that for a lot of companies, they're going to be struggling to adapt to both of those. They're going to have a workforce that is retiring on them and wasn't kept current as it was. And we are missing a generation or two of professionals in the supply chain space. We've got two contradictory things, or not contradictory, but two things coming together to create a lot of pressure on the overall supply chain workforce. Now, the flip side of that is that people don't like paying for stuff that they don't feel like is making money, which is the classic supply chain problem. It's a cost center activity. So you've got to balance that out against your actual need to deliver a product.
Totally makes sense. And when you first start working with a brand, or let's just take my audience, I'm a manufacturing brand. I'm sub $100 million. I have D2C and wholesale channels, strategic wholesale channels. And if I was considering bringing someone like you in, or I was considering taking a more holistic review of my supply chain, what are the first 1, 2, 3 steps, either in preparation for bringing someone like you in, or in preparation for a more deep dive internal review of our supply chain opportunities? What are those first foundational steps that you would advise a brand to take to get the most out of an engagement with someone like you?
I break this into, there's two major parts of this. And I think this is always the case in supply chain. We need internal alignment and we need external alignment. Internal alignment means fundamentally the guiding principle is we all know what we're doing. The way I approach that is, first, we got to figure out the data. That if I were advising you and if you just said, hey, what should I do tomorrow? And I said, don't hire me, just go do this. I would say, go figure out what your data looks like. Is your data the same across everything? Do you have the same costs in your contract? Do you have it in your spreadsheet that marketing is using? Is it all the same? Do you know how much stuff you are selling? How long it is taking you to ship stuff? If you can pull in all of that data, you're going to have a pretty holistic idea of how your business is actually functioning from a supply chain perspective. Like, there's so much stuff that is hidden in spreadsheets. People don't even know who their vendors are or how to contact them. All of these things need to be brought together. And that's the first thing I always do in a new engagement. After that is understanding what we want to accomplish and whether or not it's realistic. Talking to sales and marketing, saying, hey guys, we've been really focusing on this 2-day shipping thing. It's costing us a lot of money. Is this really valuable, or is it yes or no? And having that sort of conversation across every single vertical in your company Unfortunately, supply chain tends to run these processes because it's where everything ends up happening. But you've got to have all those conversations across all those verticals so everybody's on the same page about what they're trying to accomplish. So yeah, so that's my step one and step two. These are broad brush steps, of course. And then step three is going out to your external supply chain partners and aligning them with what you're trying to accomplish as well, so that they're clear on why you need 2-day shipping or why you don't need 2-day shipping. And the last part is communicating all of this to everybody. Once you understand how this should work, this should not be something that I, as your supply chain lead, knows and nobody else knows. You, as the salesperson, you, as the finance person, should understand that we ship in 2 days, we pay our bills within 30 days. Whatever those things mean, just the most pedantic stuff, that should be corporate knowledge, because that's going to make everybody's lives a whole lot easier. Somebody in sales may not need to know exactly what's happening in the warehouse, but they better have a good idea of what they can promise when they get pushed in a sales meeting. And they better have a good idea that your team can actually do this and they don't have to go back to the supply chain team. If you communicate all that, if you're aligned internally, the data is proper, and you communicate that externally to everybody, you're going to be in good shape to really address your supply chain. That's a lot easier said than done. There's a lot of steps in there. It's like running a marathon. It's one step at a time.
And how important is it that the business, instead of maybe making a blanket statement like, oh, we want to cut 10% of cost from our supply chain for the cost of a good sold, let's go back to the shoe analogy again. Maybe the box is, maybe you want to save 10% on the cost of this good, but you might be able to easily save 10% on the box, for example, but that's only 5% of the total cost of the good that you're selling, whereas you might only be able to save 2% on the raw materials of the leather and the rubber, but that's 90% of the cost of the good. So the net impact on the COGS, if you can really save some money on some of those inputs, like not all inputs are created equal is what I'm saying. So you might have a low piece of hanging fruit that you think, hey, it's easy to go and save 10% on the box supplier, but that doesn't move the needle enough to make that a focus. We should go focus on the leather and the rubber supplier because that's 90% of the cost of the goods that we make. So that's where we need to focus our efforts. So like in terms of prioritizing effort, how deep should they dig into that?
First of all, I apologize. My headset just...
No, you're good. I can hear you fine.
You got to go for where the money is and figure out like what's in. I am wary of save 10% on COGS because I need to understand what it all is going to our overall costs and figuring out what the overall goal is. So again, save 10%, that should be an outcome of that alignment discussion we had earlier, because there may be something else that's really driving that. And if the answer is we're going to sell to Target and we need to get this 10% cheaper, that is totally understandable. But now we have alignment on why we're doing this. Save 10% is on COGS without any context is something that is hard for me to explain to you why I'm doing it. I look at the total cost of delivery, and I may say that, hey, we're a lot better off renegotiating our freight rates or our parcel delivery rates or killing Saturday delivery, because that's going to drop our overall costs without me having to go back and try to find a new vendor for shoe leather.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I totally get that. It's what are the levers that are the easiest to pull? And the reality is, if you are basing, for example, your current negotiations on current volumes, but you have a potential PO in the pipeline that doubles your volume, and therefore you need to be negotiating on the doubled volume, not existing volume and existing momentum, that's a totally different discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a totally different discussion. It does require good forecasting, that you are better off negotiating on higher volume. Now, this goes back to concentration as well that we mentioned, but you're better off negotiating on a higher volume. But you also better be sure that you're going to be able to actually meet that volume, because otherwise you're going to have upset vendors. And you can get yourself in a cycle really fast where you think you're a sweet negotiator and you're getting all this good pricing. But what you're actually getting is a lot of runaround for people. I like to go into negotiations with a clear idea of what we can do and what we're trying to accomplish and get to honest agreements with people rather than just ask for a price cut.
Yeah, pie in the sky stuff. No, I love it. Look, this has been absolutely incredibly fascinating for me. This is an area that I'm definitely not an expert because I focus so much on the more technical and operational consulting for brands, manufacturers, distributors. So this has been super enlightening, and you've clearly, this is not your first rodeo. You've been doing this for a very long time. So I appreciate your insights and your willingness to share kind of these top tips for brands out there. Now, as we come down to the end of our time together, this is where I get to flip the script. I get to hand the microphone over to you. I get to let you ask me one question, any question you like. It can be personal or professional. Mr. Patrick Ward from ISC, what is your question for me today?
I'd kind of like to know, and this comes from my experience of I've been doing supply chain for a long time. A lot of the things that I talk about, I feel are very basic. How much do you think your brands that you work with understand about how their supply chains work?
They mostly focus on, because I'm primarily working with distributors, but distributors nowadays hardly ever are just distributors. They're usually manufacturing 10, 20, 30% of their catalog, and then a distributor for the rest of their catalog. They're primarily more worried with their internal fulfillment infrastructure, meaning whether they're working with 3PLs, whether they're working with owned warehouses with their own WMS system, or a combination of the two. And increasingly, there's a combination of three sources: owned warehouses, 3PL, and drop shipment. So when and how and where to route specific SKUs for fulfillment to specific fulfillment sources, whether that's internal or external fulfillment sources. And then a fourth route is becoming common, which is for these distributors and manufacturers to become their own marketplace, as well as a fourth ability to sell product where they never actually see the product. It never exists in their ERP. It never exists in their warehouses, but they list it on their website. And the ultimate vendor is the one that is worried about product data and everything else and getting that uploaded for sale on the marketplace. So there's four modes of fulfillment, if you will, within most manufacturing, at least domestic fulfillment capabilities. And they're far more worried about that. They're far more worried about, do we warehouse stuff ourselves? How many warehouses do we have? Where do we position them? How do we fit them out? How much automation do we have in our warehouses, or is it fully manual? What kind of WMSs are we implementing? If we're working with a 3PL, do we implement their WMS in our own warehouses as well for seamless fulfillment and data sharing? There's more architectural considerations and knowledge and understanding about their ATL, or their ability to fulfill, their ability to ship. They're far more concerned about that, I think, in many instances, than they are concerned about, once it leaves their warehouse, what carrier is it going to be with? How fast is it going to get to the customer? How can we bring down prices of that last mile of delivery, or middle mile and last mile of delivery? And they're probably not as concerned about, how can we improve the efficiency of the supply chain of the items that are making their way to our warehouses. They're far more concerned about internal operations of actually fulfilling the goods. That's the thing that they normally know like the back of their hand, and they know the costs associated with that because they can quantify that. They can say, I got 10 people working in this warehouse and we pay them on average 70 grand a year. And so I know what it costs me to lease that warehouse space or build that warehouse space or whatever. So I think they're far more au fait with internal logistical operations than they are in external logistical operations.
I know that. Yeah, that makes sense. That is the point where it's a big cost for most people.
Yes.
A huge cost for everybody. And it's also one that you can get your head around, and you're seeing the cost all the time. So that would make sense for me, and why people would be very focused on.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Now, how is the best way, if somebody is listening to this podcast, they want to get a hold of you and they want to chat to you about all things supply chain, logistics, internal, external, where they can become more efficient and just better, more well-run businesses? What's the best way to get a hold of you? Obviously, LinkedIn. We can drop the LinkedIn profile in the show notes, and we'll drop your website link in the show notes. But other than that, what's the best way to reach out to you and have a chat?
I mean, people can email me directly or give me a call. My email is patrick.ward@isc-na.com. And if somebody wants to call me or text me right now, my direct line is 415-722-4910. I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to lend somebody some advice and see how I can help out.
I love it. Patrick, this has been super educational for me, and I'm by extension for my audience too. I wish you every success with your consulting business, and I can't wait to speak to you again soon. Thank you for your time. If you'd like to get mentored by Jason for free, head over to greenwoodconsulting.net, scroll to the bottom of the page, and click Get Mentored by Jason.